Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Lynn Lowdown. I'm Wesley Days. Today's guest for today's show is Councilman Brian LaPierre. How are you, sir? How are you?
Good morning, Wesley. I'm doing great, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, no problem. You know, there's a lot of news going on with the city's budget right now, and the city council actually just passed it unanimously this Tuesday. I want to start with the protest. Before we go right into the city's budget, I want to talk about the protests that were happening outside. Can you tell me how you felt when you heard about the protest on the city's budget?
Sure. I think there's a lot of converging issues right now going on in the city of Lynn. Some is budgetary, but most of it is social unrest and, institutional racism that our city and our nation are going through. So that is no surprise that folks are taking to the streets. Our citizens in Lynn have been doing this very peacefully over the last several weeks with police involvement, I will say. And the protests that have been going on is a cry for help in a lot of ways, both socially and racially. But I look at the budget as a roadmap and a place to where we have to get to. And that's why my colleagues and I supported it unanimously Tuesday night. The budget is not the end, it's more of the start of what we need to be doing going forward, fiscal year 2022 now, involving more voices. Clearly, the pandemic has wreaked havoc on us, Wesley, and this was not the way we wanted to present, or the mayor's budget was presented to us. It wasn't, let's say, the norm. Normally, we have dozens of budget hearings, citizen participation, inclusivity. We hear from all voices. Our city hall doors are open. We welcome all voices. It just wasn't a reality due to the pandemic and all of the other things occurring around COVID-19. So we are now committed, myself and my colleagues, as you saw, we all went down and were there in solidarity with the protesters Tuesday evening. So I think that in itself speaks volumes about the commitment this city council is making to make sure we know we're not perfect and we know we have to make improvements in all areas, particularly in the budget in our community. But this is a start, not an end. And I was happy to support the mayor's $25,000 allowance above and beyond the regular police budget to do just that. Get involved in the community, start listening, give us some resources to really dig deeper and find out what this budget needs to reflect going forward.
So I want to talk about the Lynn Police Department budget for a quick moment, because that was also a part of the protesting that was going on yesterday. One part of the protest was, or overall the protest was named Fund Peace, Not Force Protest. So it was talking about the increased budget of the police department. Do you think that it should have been decreased, or that the police budget should have taken kind of a step back? I know with all of the social unrest that you're talking about, that a lot of people are concerned about the budgetary or the funds that are going to the police department at this time.
And I would just say, frankly, I think it's the opposite effect. When you look at the police budget, it's about $21 million, a small percentage of the overall $375 million, which we passed. And a lot of that goes to our schools. It's mandated by Chapter 70 state law. But when you say defund or deinvest, I don't think that's the answer. I would prefer to say it's a reallocation, and it's a doubling down of investment to increase the pie of the police budget, not to take away from what we've done already. Frankly, we've hired 18 new police officers, and I'm not saying more cops make for better, safer streets, but I know it's not the answer to all the crime that's around, and I understand that it's more to that issue. And I'm not a big advocate for the school to prison pipeline or any of these things that we talk so much about in our community. So I think we need adequate to really spend some more money separate and aside from what's there, that $21 million, and I'm talking millions, to be able to offer our Lynn police the professional development opportunities that they have not received, the training that it will take, the enhanced training that has to be done within the rank and file to really educate and speak to our community. And then we start adding some of these services that folks are talking about. And I don't think it's defunding. As I said, it's mental health, it's counseling, it's an anti-violent response crisis team to some calls that are noise related or can be just quality of life issues. You don't need armed cops going into neighborhoods for those kind of calls, but we cannot step back from, we are now at 186 officers. It's grossly still a critical shortage when you look at surrounding and large cities like Lynn. We had a high of 225 officers in 1995 under Bill Clinton's crime bill. Pat McManus was the mayor then. He invested in police. We were at all-time high. We have dropped to 150 under the former mayor, and 6 years of non-hiring created all these retirements. That 186 number just gets us to that level. It's not even adequate, but it's at a level. And we cannot begin now by cutting 97.7% of that police budget is tied up in salary, it's tied up in overtime, it's tied up in vehicle expenses, and things of that like. So we got to identify new money and new revenue for our police to give them the training they need and are looking for.
Great. So, I know that a lot of the conversation on Tuesday was talking about the police department budget, but kind of going away from that for a moment, what other important city expenditures should community members know about and should, have an understanding about as well?
Sure, it's a great question. I mean, a lot has been taken up by the headlines on the police front, but hiring an additional 20 firefighters over the past couple of years has helped us on grants. We're now going to have to start paying our share for those grants, so that's an expense. Obviously, the DPW with public services, roads, and resurfacing. You might see along Linfield Street right now and across the city, they're doing these dimpled handicap access points on the sidewalks so that we are in compliance. We're going to do a whole bunch of roadways this summer. It's already begun. That's certainly DPW, fire. And then you have to look at what I talked about earlier, our schools. Our schools are going to need so many resources now since COVID and the pandemic. And how are we going to really talk about how everyone's talking about reopening schools in a safe and healthy way, the PPE costs, the extra internet and device costs, and all of the things that the Lynn Public Schools are trying to provide during this unprecedented. It really does take a lot of chunk out of the budget. I would also add things like arts and culture, things like the senior center. I supported the amendment by the mayor to add another $146,000 into the senior center. When that does get open, we need a new senior center in the city of Lynn. I also support, another big ticket item when you look at the budget is health insurance and making sure that our workers in the library and city hall and across the city, workers are treated fairly by being able, we can give them, we did this without no layoffs throughout the city. We're a big employer of the city. And I think it was a really responsible budget laid out by the mayor and CFO Michael Bertino. They explained to us if we didn't pass it, the dire straits that we would be in with layoffs and unemployment costs soaring. So we were really in a rock and a hard place, Wesley, in passing the budget Tuesday night. But we went in with it with a very conservative approach based on last year's state's fiscal numbers and using some of our reserves as well to make sure that we balance this budget and didn't harm workers or city services.
So I want to move to something else about the city's budget as well. And we talked a little bit earlier in our conversation right now about this. You recently said in a Facebook post that, quote, the process for citizen input on the fiscal year 2022 begins today. Can you talk to me about how you would like to see the community members interact with the fiscal year budget of 2022?
I would love to, and I meant what I said. As chair of the council subcommittee on budget, we need to have a more inclusive process. There's no doubt about that. The mayor usually will begin by speaking to everyone in the October of a given year and present his budget around May to the citizens, and then we start our public hearings and we adopt by the end of June. That's a normal cycle As I said earlier, the pandemic really threw us for a loop. But my thing that I want to see and advocate for is beginning today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be proactive. I'm going to get out into the community as best I can with masks and PPE and distancing. But I'd like to have open air community conversations with the mayor, with our department heads, and bring our messages around budget, what's important to the city's residents. And how you do that is perhaps meeting in every ward of the city. There are 7 wards. Maybe we'll pick a public park once a month, and we'll build out community hearings where we go to the community rather than the community coming to City Hall next May, because clearly that has not worked. It particularly did not work under this pandemic. But we're very willing to do the outreach. I've scheduled meetings with neighbor to neighbor and prevent the cycle. And I'm going to continue to meet organization by organization to make sure that our budget next year reflects the needs of our citizens.
So I want to kind of play a woulda, coulda, shoulda for one moment, if you don't mind. If the city's budget was tabled as the people in the protest were calling for, what do you think the impact would have been on the city's budget?
Well, as it was characterized to us Tuesday evening and even a little prior to that in meetings with the CFO, we cannot take that. We have to have a balanced budget. By going to a 1/12, in effect, it doesn't allow us to meet our current payroll obligations. It kind of comes, if you think of it, it's a grinding halt. And the analogy someone said to, I think the mayor used, which was a good one, it's like, we have enough money to get us through some of the month, but not the whole month. By doing that, we come up short. And we're also compounding the issue, not in July or August on a 1/12 budget. Where we really see the impact is if we do have to make those local C cuts, local 9C cuts, which occur if the state revenues aren't what they are expected. Remember, a budget is just really a roadmap and a hope and a prayer this year in particular, because our state revenues are so down from this pandemic. So we would be taking a huge risk of not meeting payroll, not meeting vendors, not meeting a lot of our obligations by way of bills by going with the 1/12. The state has been able to do that, but they are able to catch up in a much different way based on their revenues month by month. We were all fearful that come January, February, March, there was not going to be the resources available, and that would again lead to massive layoffs. So it was safer to do this. With all due respect to folks that wanted us to table, we heard that message. We did some investigating on it. There were a couple of avenues we could have taken, but the safest perspective that we had, based on the advisement of Sean Cronin, who's our state revenue person who oversees what we're doing on the budget, our local CFO, Chief Financial Officer Michael Bertino, and the mayor, we thought it was best to just approve the budget and make sure that we have enough funding going forward throughout the summer into the fall.
So my final question for you is kind of an overall hope for the city. So what in the next year, I know that things could be completely different within, the next year, talks of a vaccine, the possibility of things opening back up to a new normal, maybe not to the same normal that we had before the COVID virus, but now a new normal that everyone is speaking about. Can you talk to me about some of the hopes that you have for Lynn in the upcoming year?
Oh, absolutely. Wesley, heading into March 13th of 2020, Lynn was having a banner revenue year for its city. We have had projects. So, the North Harbor was just in the local paper yesterday, a $100 million investment, breakwater, 300 plus market rate apartments are all going to bring tax dollars to a vacant Beacon Chevrolet that stood vacant my whole lifetime, over 40 years. Nothing was done with it. So all these revenue opportunities, whether it be medical and recreational marijuana shops that are now permitted in full, the Monroe Street project, all of these things came to such a grinding halt that we need to recover the projects that were in the ground and on paper and ready to go and permitted and ready to go. We had over $1 million new in permitting, local permitting, just from the building projects alone in the city. We have to address all of the needs of the city, whether it's educational, housing, food insecurity. We started that food drive at the Salvation Army. I'm really proud of the partnership between the Lynn City Council and Salvation Army. We're not stopping because there's a pandemic, or it's starting to at least do a little better in the city of Lynn. We're continuing that. We're trying to find the resources to maintain mutual aid, maintain our services, get our kids in a remote learning setting that's way better than it was this past spring. We know we can do better in education, whether it's in person or it's hybrid or remote. And I'm looking forward to neighborhood by neighborhood, building along with my council colleagues, each of the wards, so that we are better prepared for something like this until a vaccine, as you said, can be the norm. But the new normal in Lynn must be continuing to press on our expansion of both our commercial and to some extent our residential tax base, while trying to hold the line, but we don't want to cut services. Services are such in great need right now. I'd hate to see us fall back, including a new senior center. I really want to see that in the coming years.
Okay, well, Councilman LaPierre, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. I really appreciate our conversation. For all of you that are watching LCTV, thank you so much for watching another edition of the Lynn Lowdown. I'm your host, Wesley Days, and we'll see you next time.